Welcome, everyone, to another webinar of our publisher, Göttingen. I am Rodrigo Silva, the Communications Manager, and today we are discussing the latest research on migration and refugee flows. This event is based on a thematic issue that we published in our open access journal, Politics and Governance, in late 2021. I will soon share the link with you. Today's panel is composed by Inmaculada Martínez-Zarzoso from the University of Göttingen in Germany, editor of the issue, José Groizard from the University of the Balearic Islands in Spain, and Juliette Milgram from the University of Granada, also in Spain. José and Juliette are our authors of the aforementioned issue. We also have the pleasure of welcoming Martin Hofmann, specialist on migration research and policy, and main advisor to the Director General of the International Center for Migration Policy Development. Welcome and thank you for your presence here today. Before we kick off this webinar, let me share some information with our attendees. This is the order of presentations for today. Inmaculada, as editor of the issue, will go first to contextualize a bit the discussion for today. She will be followed by José and then by Juliette. In the end, after Juliette, we'll have the remarks by Martin Hofmann. After Martin, we will jump to the Q&A session with our attendees. And so to our audience out there, you are free throughout the whole event to ask the questions to our speakers that will be asked in the end of the webinar. And you are also able to upvote questions that other attendees ask. You are also free to use the chat and to share your comments, your thoughts, your ideas, etc. with us, always throughout the event. One last note, if you are on Twitter, do feel free to follow Politics and Governance accounts at CogitatuPag. You can see the handle in the bottom of the screen. Be in touch with our publications, call for papers, the impact of our research, etc. And without further delay, I will now pass the word to Inmaculada, start this webinar, and wish you all a very, very pleasant event. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Rodrigo. I would like to start with my thanks to Politics and Governance for organizing the webinar, and also to all the authors of the special issue for their contributions, as well as the audience for joining. The main aim of organizing this issue was twofold. First, it was the publication of the issue, gathering a number of authors working on this topic from two perspectives, from the economic and the political science perspective, and also using distinct analytical frameworks. The second one is because we identify, or also with colleagues here in Göttingen, a momentum to reflect that the events that were taking place recently in relation to migration and refugee flows were very turbulent, and also, having some special characteristics in comparison to the past. Indeed, although population movements have been happening between countries and continents since, the very past, and those are not a recent phenomena, what is new today is that migration flows are increasingly linked to the globalization processes and also to environmental degradation. Most of the migrants leave their homes still for economic reasons, but of course also due to political instability, to wars, and to higher frequency of natural disasters. Of the total migrant population, those that are escaping from conflicts or persecution still represent a small fraction of those of the total, and they are entitled to obtain refugee status. However, climatic refugees, they are not legally entitled to ask for asylum, and this is still a pending issue. To give a bit of context, in the late 2000s, Europe faced a growing migration flows especially from the African continent following the Arab Spring, and also the growing instability, not only in North Africa, also in the Middle East, and lately also in Central Africa and Sub-Saharan Africa. This process exacerbated in 2015 when Angela Merkel announced a welcoming policy, which led to the massive arrival of immigrants and to the consequent opposition from a number of Eastern European countries, such, for example, Hungary, which did perceive this policy as a negative example, and also to the emergence of right political parties in which they were using also this anti-migration policy as their own flag. Other regions in the world, of course, were also affected by similar problems. For example, Venezuela with the Venezuelan crisis, or the ethnic persecutions in Asia. So there are many more examples all over the world. This migration crisis emerging in different parts of the world highlights, on the one hand, the inadequacy of the existing governance structures at the national and supranational level, and also a problem more related to the public perception of migration and whether migration is good or is not good for the population in general. And therefore, there are many questions on how to deal with migration that remain unsolved. And in this context, we have in this issue, in this thematic issue, 8 contributions, 8 articles that analyze migration flows and migration governance, as I said before, from very different analytical perspectives. 5 of them examine the role that several factors play either in explaining international migration flows or its effects. And among them are cultural diversity, information technology flows, governance, terrorism, and attitudes towards migration. And the 3 remaining contributions are country studies that analyze the socioeconomic causes or effects of migration in 3 countries, Portugal, Spain, and Germany, devoting special attention to forced migration and refugee flows. And now I will just say a sentence about each of the contributions, and after that the 2 authors that we have here, so Luis and Juliette, will talk a bit more about their own papers. Starting with the first contribution, Maite Alguacil and Luisa Lama Sabater, in their paper they examine the link between immigrant cultural diversity and economic performance at the provincial level, and they find that greater cultural diversity, specifically due to active to labor migration, stimulates economic activity. The second contribution is by Cristina Blasi Casagran, Colin Boland, Elena Sanchez Montijano, and Eva Vila Sanchez, and they examine 3 predictive tools to predict migration, and they use a comparative qualitative approach and conclude that each of them has advantages and disadvantages, and provide several factors, so the authors provide several factors that should be taken into account and into consideration to improve each of the 3 tools presented. The next contribution is by Federico Caccia, Jordi Paniagua, and Francisco Requena, and they present an analysis of the impact of terrorism attacks on asylum migration using a gravity equation that includes both international migration and internally displaced people. And they find that those attacks foster more international than internal migration. Also dealing, the next contribution, is by Teresa Maria Garcia Muñoz and Juliette Milgram, that is here with us. And they use a multi-level approach and find that education is one of the best tools to change inaccurate perceptions when assessing the role played by immigrants in the host country. And we will learn more about this later. Also dealing with the attitudes towards migrants and refugees, but in this case, with respect to the Visegrad 4 in Eastern Europe, Artur Groizard explores the official policy responses to the refugee crisis and concludes that migration crisis alarm the traditional cleavages at the supra local level and reinforced hostility towards migrants. Next, Inés Cabral and Thomas Suerz, they deal with the consequences of the increasing migration to rural areas in Portugal at the locality level and conclude that balancing power relations between actors are needed in order to improve the conditions in which those migrants live. Ismael Galvez Iniesta and José Luis Groizard, José Luis is also with us, focus on the Spanish case, and they find that Spaniards' voting behavior does not differ as much as expected, according to other authors, from this in the neighboring European countries, and we are going to learn more of it later. Finally, the study of which I am also an author, together with Felicitas Nowak-Lehmann and Adriana Cardozo, examined the determinants of both international migration and asylum migration from developing countries to Germany. And we find that not only economic and political factors, but also climatic ones explain asylum seekers' flows. And concluding, I hope I gave you some hints of the content and that I motivated you to read the contributions, and I will pass my word to Rodrigo. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Inmaculada, for this contextualization of the issue. We'll be now hearing from our first author, José Groizard.
Thank you. Thank you for giving me the opportunity to talk about my own work with Ismael Galvez Iniesta from my own university and about this the immigration and politics, and especially on political support. So and wrapping the political discourse against immigration is key to understanding the rise of populism in Western democracies. Let me just give you a couple of examples. For example, Donald Trump in the presidential elections in 2016 proposed building a wall along the Mexican border to fight against immigration, and especially undocumented immigration to the US. And let's talk about Europe as well, our closest neighbor countries. There are significant voters supporting far-right political parties that oppose to immigration across Europe. So our first question in the paper to address is, we start thinking about, okay, is there a political premium to parties that oppose immigration? Or more precisely, what's the role of immigration, both documented and undocumented, in shaping political voters or in shaping voters' political preferences in general, but in the special case of Spain? I will talk about the special case of Spain thanks to the statistics that allow us to differentiate and to measure very accurately what is an undocumented migrant. So by reviewing the literature, we found many works on economics and non-economic effects of immigration. So there is a large standing literature talking about how immigration affects natives' employment and wages. And also there are several works on public finance considerations, talking about how immigration or how immigrants are supporting the welfare state. They are net gainers or contributors to the welfare state. And there is also a literature on immigration and criminality, and on cultural diversity, as we will hear from other papers in this special issue, and also on attitudes towards immigrants. But we found a scarce literature on voting, how immigration affects voting. And then we just heard about 3 papers studying and concluding that immigration favors far-right political parties in national elections. There is evidence on Italy, there is evidence on France, and recently there is a new paper on how immigration was capitalized by the Republican Party in the US when this party embraced the anti-immigration discourse. So, then when we look at the Spanish case, what we found is that the only study talk about immigration and political support just conclude the opposite. I mean that immigration is capitalized basically by the left-wing parties. So we found that Spain was an interesting case, just to it was an exceptional experience among our neighboring countries. So in this paper, what we argue is that the presence of irregular immigrants might intensify both economic and non-economic channels, and that the effect or its effect on voting behavior will be independent from the one caused by regular immigrants. And let me explain a little bit why. What's the rationale of this distinction, or why the difference or the distinction between regular and irregular immigrants, documented and undocumented immigrants might matter in this context. Well, first of all, there are economic channels, traditional economic channels that has been emphasized, as irregular immigrants are normally expelled from the formal labor market. They are relegated to work in worse conditions than natives and even than regular immigrants. And there is some evidence that they face higher risk of being unemployed. So as a result, the undocumented migrants hardly affect voters' jobs or wages, though voters might reject the inequality and precariousness associated with the social group and not the group per se. In addition, voters might reject irregular immigration to the extent that it places a tax burden on them, since these immigrants cannot contribute to the direct financing of public services that they are often entitled to enjoy, such as education or public health. So there is a kind of anti-redistribution discourse in this issue. And as I said before, there are some non-economic channels that might matter, and probably they matter the most in the when we distinguish documented versus undocumented migrants. For example, immigrants might change the value of local amenities, so they create externalities, negative externalities to local residents, and this channel might be affecting both regular and irregular immigrants. But so unless these two types of immigrants redistribute across different locations differently, then we might find that this channel could also affect voting behavior. Secondly, voters might perceive the presence of irregular migrants, which are unemployed at the streets, as a threat of their cultural identity, if voters perceive that they are different culturally, or they have different traits that makes them different, practice different religions, and etc. So there might be some kind of identity issue behind the political response of voters. And there is also maybe the issue that illegal immigration might stoke natives' fears that the immigrants will carry out criminal activities. Also, this is open to much discussion in the literature. But and finally, but not least, we believe also that even moderate voters might reject irregular immigration, including border crossing, simply because they believe that the rule of law and as a national public good should prevail over other humanitarian principles, and that the international labor flows should be regulated. So with this theoretical background, we test several hypotheses with the Spanish data. So we just, I'm going to skip most of the methodological details unless someone wants to ask more precisely at the end. So we just use data for Spain because it's a good case to measure both type of immigration, and analyze different elections using panel data techniques. And what we find is that an increase in the share of irregular migrants increase the share of votes to the Conservative Party, but has no impact on the vote share of the left-wing party, in this case, the PSOE, the Socialist Party. So we refute that irregular immigrants are polarizing the political support. As in other countries, there was previous evidence, not on the irregular immigration, but in general with immigration. Secondly, we find that voters respond to rising regular migration the other way around, favoring the left wing and having no effect on the vote share of the right. So again, the results indicate that there is no polarization, I mean, as in other countries. So immigration is not generating support for the streams of the political scope. And finally, we decided to include the new political forces that arose in Spain in the latest 2 or 3 political contexts, now that are political forces that are at the stream of the political distribution. Vox on the right wing, and Podemos on the left wing. So when we include in the analysis the new political forces, then we test the role played by immigration and national identity discourse in the general elections that took place after the refugee crisis of 2015. And the results indicated that after considering the increased political competition, there were greater proportions of irregular immigrants producing changes in the distribution of the share of voters from the left to the right. I mean, so a strongest political competition in the political arena then move voters in general to the right from the left. And in contrast, greater proportion of regular immigrants produce support for the right and the far right. So although the parties on the left do not seem to benefit from this, that is, the results indicate that the right has capitalized on the narrative of restricting irregular migration. And that's all, at least for now.
Thank you, Jose, for your presentation. Thank you very much. We will be hearing now from Juliette Milgram. Thank you.
Thank you. So thank you for the invitation, and the presentation of Jose has given me facilitated me my work, because he also reviewed several motivation and facts that are at stake when for the preference of voters and for the opinion towards immigration. So this is in our article, which is a joint paper with one colleague of mine from the University of Granada, Teresa García Muñoz. We study what are the main determinants of individuals in their opinion towards immigration, because as it has been mentioned before, we all acknowledge that there are more and more movements of people, immigration around the world, and immigration policies that we heard of many electoral debates. So we wanted to know more about, to try to explain what shape the attitudes of people towards immigration, and in particular trying to disentangle if the role of economic factors is so important as other factors as social concerns or concern about social norms and different cultural differences and so on. So what we do is in this article is we use a very huge data set for 61 countries, which is based on a survey called the World Value Survey that probably many people know. And this survey provides us with a very great opportunity because we have a lot of information about the characteristics of individuals and their opinion towards a wide range of questions. And in particular, we focus on one question, which is how people evaluate the impact of immigrants in the development of the country. So we voluntarily focus on this question, which is biased towards economics, and because we wanted to isolate if economic factors are determinant in the position of individuals. So let me share with you just one graph to show you how heterogeneous or how various is our sample. We have 61 countries. So here you have the average opinion regarding the economic impact of immigration, which individual can indicate that according to them this impact is bad, which would be very bad, which could be 1, or very good, which could be 5. So on average, worldwide, the answer is about 2.94, so not really a good assessment. And we have relatively poor country, middle-income country, and rich country. And we don't observe a very significant relationship between the level of wealth of the country and the average opinion among countries. So then what we focus on 2 things. First, on the individual characteristics that are which individuals support more or make a good assessment of the impact, economic impact of immigration. And second, we focus on what are the context, macroeconomic context that can influence this opinion. So concerning, let me share again briefly. So concerning the individual characteristics, we find as other study that we generalize this result, that there are some characteristics that have a negative influence. For instance, older people make a more negative assessment of the impact of immigration. People standing at the right of the political spectrum also, all things equal, have a more negative opinion. We find that the gender, the number of children, the marital status do not have a significant influence, and more unexpectedly, being unemployed or being retired do not have a significant impact, which is important because these are variables are more related with labor market situation, and obviously for without people concerned regarding the preserving the welfare state or how immigration can influence fiscal burdens or fiscal benefits. And in the list of characteristics that exert a positive influence on the opinion toward economic influence of immigrants, people, obviously people who are immigrants themselves have a more positive influence, people living in a larger town, students, people attending religious services, people express more in order. All these characteristics have a positive influence on this opinion. And what is important also, the household income and the level of education is just a positive impact. So we are going to dig more in this aspect. So this is the first part concerning the individual characteristics, and then in the second step we studied, we checked if the macroeconomic context have importance for this attitude. And what we find is that in general, the macroeconomic context, such as the growth, the inflation rate, also the unemployment rate, do not have to see a significant impact, do not influence really the opinion of people. Okay, everything, taking all of the things equal. Okay, what we find to have a significant impact is the stock of migrants. What does it mean? It means that we find that in countries where the migrant stock is high, people tend to support more or to have a positive assessment of the economic impact of migration, which would signify that having more contact with migrants or a history of a country familiar with migration exerts a positive impact on this region. And another consideration, that I don't want to put too much results, but even if we don't understand fully this graph, what we check is if people in the labor market, people employed and so on, is whatever the sector, and we compare the attitude of these people, the opinion of these people in the labor market with the people outside the labor market, meaning unemployed, retired, or without any occupation. And we find that there is no significant differences between the opinion of these people. So this is another convincing proof that economic factor or how people are affected in the personal income is not the main point when expressing their view about the economic impact of immigration. So what we find is education is the main point, and there is a difference between the type of country. In high-income countries, more educated people are always more prone to immigration. In lower middle-income country or in poorer country of our sentence, the level of education doesn't make so much difference. And in contrast, in middle-income countries, we do find that education, the influence of education is the opposite as the one of in the richer country, which is, we think, important to know. So to finish, we think we have four important conclusions. First, non-economic determinants are more important to explain attitudes toward immigration. So it is important to take it into account. Education, formal education at least, is an effective tool to improve the integration of newcomers, at least in high-income countries. The people with lower level of education are more skeptical about migration process, so we think that integration policies have to devote more efforts to address the worries of these people, of this class of people. And third, we think that there is an important challenge because nowadays knowledge is more based, is more built on the basis of information obtained through internet, social mass media. So it is not only formal education, but this knowledge is also important and will also have a big influence on the opinion. And policymakers should give more attention to this and how to communicate immigration policies, and also how to increase social trust, because if not, we would have probably big problems as we have seen in some countries. And last, we want to point out the growing sensitization of some middle-income countries such as Brazil, Russia, Turkey, which have big immigration rates, and where, according to our study, the opinions are completely disconnected or more disconnected with the education level and so on. So we think the situation could be complicated for the integration of immigrants in these emerging countries. So I think this is an area of future research, and obviously we would like to point out this question. So thank you very much. I would be happy to listen to questions.
Thank you, Juliette, for the presentation. We'll be now hearing from Martin Hofmann, please.
Thank you, Rodrigo, and also thank you to my distinguished speakers. I read your chapters with great joy, and I highly recommend also to the audience to read these two chapters, because they will tell you a lot more about migration policy making, or the margins within migration policy making has to move than many more traditional volumes. So if you allow me, I will comment or share a few thoughts with you from the perspective of migration policy making, what my organization also stands for. And in our work, we constantly are confronted with a reality, and this reality is my first point that I want to make, is that migration policy and migration governance is shaped by perceptions of migration rather than by migration realities. We know about the economic contribution to public finances, welfare systems, demographics, criminality, whatever we look at, whatever indicators we look at, they tell us that migration has rather a positive, or makes a positive contribution to countries of destination. However, still a majority or a decisive minority of these societies is skeptical about migration and sees it critically. And this majority or decisive minority is critical because it has the potential to swing elections. And political systems react to this fact, and political parties try to capitalize on it. We should not totally condemn them. In democracies, party systems, it is their job to try to win elections and to win majorities. But we have to be aware of the fact that we have a real migration reality we can discuss about, and we have a political migration reality. And this political reality shapes migration policy, and it's based rather on perceptions than on realities. So now, how do these perceptions form? My main hypothesis is that migration is in many ways a proxy issue in its political manifestations. So migration policy does not deal so much with migration, but rather with other issues. One of the issues that I would like to highlight is that I think is of particular relevance is that migration is often perceived as the reason or as an indicator for undesired societal change. Economic transformation, access to opportunities, housing situation, identities of social groups, neighborhoods, and so on and so forth. And these transformations affect people, and they raise concerns and fears, especially among those groups in the society that objectively feel threatened by them. And migration is then held responsible for that, although in reality it has only little to do with that. I think Juliette's research in a way confirms that Another example would be Eurobarometer data tell us that the biggest spike in negative attitudes towards migrants was not in 2015 as a reaction to the refugee crisis, but it was in 2008, 2009 in reaction to the global financial crisis. So when people really saw themselves threatened in their livelihoods, then they developed those, or very strongly developed those attitudes. Why is then the research so important that was presented here? Firstly, because no political system will escape those perceptions. I think it's also extremely important from our perspective that you identified those attitudes also in countries outside of Europe and outside of the EU. It's a misperception, especially in policy making, that only we have a problem, so to speak, with migration. You find that in any society. I've worked with Iraq, Georgia, Tunisia, all the examples you brought, and I learned this there. Also there is skepticism. So we cannot simply expect, that other regions would solve whatever we consider as political problems, because they will have the same attitudes towards migration there. And I think the second important observation is the link between attitudes and perceptions and socio-demographic characteristics. Who is the most skeptical about migration? Simplified, it's the older cohorts, the less educated, the ones in rural areas. All those who feel that they cannot really cope with the change that I have mentioned before, with the transformations. So for the well-educated, they feel in a position to also take on this challenge, and this makes them more relaxed, so to speak, about migration. By now, in many European countries, half of the electorate is 50 years and older. And the share of this age group among voters is increasing. So we have two contradicting tendencies. We have, in a way, European societies that get more and more accustomed to immigration, but at the same time, the voters, or the group of voters, increases, or the share increases, that does not get accustomed. So we have a sort of decoupling of, I would say, social reality and political reality again. And this brings me to the second research, and why that is so important. How should political systems react to these facts? Again, let me start with an important observation. I think until 2015, 2016, you can say there was a certain consensus among mainstream parties how they would talk about migration or not. And very openly critical or fully restrictive positions were left to the so-called populists. But the refugee crisis changed that. Especially conservative parties opened up to certain distinctively critical narratives and started to campaign in that direction. And it won them elections, that's a fact. But however, for all governments that promise to stop migration, this is pretty difficult to make this a reality, also for President Trump, as we know. There are very powerful drivers that speak against the geopolitical drivers, economic imbalances, demographic change, now environmental factors, but also the strong demand for migrant labor. And the price for strict migration control is very high. And societies are not always ready to pay it. So there is the saying that the migration issue might win you elections, but it also might lose you governments. And I think 5 years after the refugee crisis, we see this also now in electoral outcomes in Europe. The second way, not to give in to this, I would say, populist stream, is to go in another direction. And we've heard that today, this can also be successful. Not to promise to fully stop migration, but to promise to control it, to steer it, to manage it in a way that is seen as beneficial. And refers to a very old conclusion in political science. Max Weber had already said that the main expectation towards governments is that they act, that they are in control, that they show that they are in control, and then the political audience can also accept approaches or outcomes that might be different from like a general perception, as long as the governments deliver on that. And I think this makes the findings of the second research so important, because it demonstrates that as government, you do not necessarily get punished for an increase of regular migrants. Actually, you might even get rewarded for that. And as long as voters have the impression that migration is managed in an orderly way. This is a very important, from my perspective, a very important and very positive message for policymakers, also for me and my organization, because this is what we try to stand for. It's always good to see this view confirmed by research, especially when this research uses quantitative methods and establishes results that are really representative for broader populations. Again, I thank you for that. I congratulate you and give the floor back to Rodrigo. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Martin. Thank you very much. We'll go now for the questions. I'll perhaps start with one here that I'll ask Inmaculada. It's from Boris Braniza. He asked if we could talk a little bit about the impact of climate change on migration and refugee flows.
Thank you very much, Boris, for the question. Nice to hear from you. He was in Göttingen at some point. He did his PhD here, so nice to hear from you. Actually, there is a lot of research nowadays concerning the effects of climate change on migration. And although this research started already in the last century, initially the data were not that good as the data we have now. And therefore, a lot has been going on in the 21st century. To make it short, I think the first studies were mostly at the country level. And now we are moving to studies using satellite data, mobile phone data, and the like. And therefore, there is a lot of progress going on. Even though also the country studies in the past already found that climate change was having an impact on migration, especially in countries in arid or semi-arid areas in Africa, and mostly the slow onset changes. So that means changes in average temperature and average precipitation, and also more anomalies in temperature and precipitation. Those were pushing migration first, maybe inside the countries, but eventually also international migration. And this is what the country studies show. And now the new studies using more grid cells, geographically determined, they also find that there are recent studies in Nature, for example, showing that also climate change affect refugee flows. So therefore, I think this is real, and both also natural disasters affect migration and also these slow onset changes. And you all know about the Paris Agreement, about the 2050 and the decarbonization need. And if not, we will not be able to have this 1.5 degree, but more, and therefore we will have more of it, more climatic migration. And this is a real worry that will even be worse in 10 or 20 years if nothing really different happens. So therefore, my view on it is that more research is needed, and especially concerning also the increasing frequency in natural disasters that we see almost every second week in different countries. Even here in Germany, as you know, last year we have floods, very intense floods, and now we have also storms, and in the US, and with the fires in Australia, in California. So therefore, this is a real worry, and I think this is also going to push more migrants from the most affected zones to the developed countries. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Inmaculada. José, we have received a question here by Michelle Pace that I would like to hear your opinion on this. She asks, what do you think about narratives as method to help us design practice-oriented work?
Well, this is a very interesting topic that actually Martin also worked with and suggests with and I think definitely that narratives, I mean, in the context that I presented, play a very important role. I mean, when we believe how attitudes towards immigration are created, I mean, we think that narratives that are created by our leaders and political parties plays an important role, but also facts plays an important role as well. How voters, for example, they create their political preferences is definitely a crosswalk of these two inputs, narratives that are basically provided by our representatives, and also facts, which are which is what Martin called reality. So definitely, I think that we need a better understanding how these two place and help us to set up, you know, the political preferences, and that's a very difficult question because of course narratives are fitted by facts and reality, and we might think that sometimes both are disconnected, but we that might be the case in circumstances that politicians just create fictions around problems that do not exist, and they want to just manipulate reality just to take benefit of some minor margins on voters. But I think that definitely we need to do more research on how these two ingredients help to understand how preferences are shaped across individuals.
Thank you, Jose. Thank you very much. And now, exactly jumping to Martin, a question that we have received by Maria do Carmo Gonçalves. She'd like to know a little bit more about South-South refugee movements. Martin, what can you tell us on that?
Well, I think a very basic conclusion is that most of what we want to call refugee movements take place in the global south. The global south, of course, is a questionable category as such, but geographically speaking, economically speaking, most displacement and most refugee movements take place in the global south, and we have a very would say large number of what is called the so-called protracted refugee situations in the global south. This means or have been taken place for 10 years and much longer. Here, what we really see in the recent past is what was mentioned before, is the additional impact of environmental factors. So also displacement is sometimes caused by different or many aspects. But just to give you one example now, Afghanistan, the Taliban takeover rightly sparks concerns in the neighborhood, but also in Europe, with regard to a significant increase of refugees and asylum seekers. But most sources, and also we have worked in the country until the takeover, tell us that most of the displacement still, half a year after the Taliban takeover, is caused by environmental reasons and not by political reasons or violent episodes and developments, so events. So you can really say we have to face really an additional a very forceful driver of displacement, especially in the global south. Those countries will be affected the most. Final remark, how to go about it? Well, there's a lot of improvement needed. I think we have much more awareness of a global responsibility these days towards refugees than we used to have. Unfortunately, this does not really translate yet into global responsibility sharing, if we want to call it like that. Currently, there's still the estimates that only 3% of the globally displaced or refugees have access to the so-called durable solutions of integration, safe return, or resettlement. There's a lot of space for improvement, and I'm carefully hopeful that this acknowledgement of this global responsibility will also translate to more practiced solidarity in the years to come. Thank you.
Thank you, Martin. There is also a question we have receiving some. I will perhaps read. This is also directed to José by Elia Lopes. First of all, yes, the webinar will be recorded and uploaded to our YouTube channel very soon. José, the question is, and directly to Martin, if he wants to add after, what is your view on politically and ideologically loaded migrants, refugees, impinging on election processes and outcomes? Could this behavior shape migration policy making?
Oh, tough question. I mean, we haven't dealt with this issue in our work, but so if I had to interpret the Spanish case and our results, I mean, in Spain has been 5 legalization process of immigrants that enter irregularly, sometimes as refugees, sometimes as just crossing borders illegally, and then it's been 5 legalization processes, and they have been undertaken by the right and the left wings when governing, but the most important one was taken in 2005 by President Zapatero in a socialist president. And then, so we might think that big legalization processes then had an impact on political elections, since when they become regular, maybe they are assimilated as workers or middle class, supporting whatever workers and middle class used to support, normally center-left parties. So if we believe that regularizing immigrants is a way to support left-wing parties, then migration policy might have a different reading. And as long as our results indicates that irregular migration sustain support and move support to the right and not to the left, but regular migration do the vice versa, so increase support to the left and not to the right, then migration policy making might have reading an ideologically motivated reading of what migrants are providing in terms of ideology to the societies that are accepting and hosting them. That's a good question. Tough one.
Thank you, Jose. Also, Martin, can we hear your takes on this question?
Yes, of course. I'm not sure whether I got the question 100% right, but I also read it in a way whether like radicalization or like politically very outspoken migrants might have then an impact on the the political situation in a receiving country. Well, I can tell you the biggest fear of any government is a terrorist, ideologically or a religiously motivated terrorist attack close to an election. That is the biggest fear that all governments have. I think, and again here, a lot of research would be needed. I'm not so sure that is so straightforward. I'm not so sure whether we can really say that such situations have really this impact, and also on elections or support for political parties. In one way, they might only confirm those who are very negative about immigration, see themselves confirmed, but you always also see them like a political or cultural counter movement. It simply says, well, we cannot simply for the deeds of a few radicalized persons, we cannot hold accountable large shares of our population. So I think, again, the reality is a lot more complex, also the political reality. But I can definitely tell you that for political parties, and especially for governments, that is in a way the biggest fear, that ideologically charged migrants commit heinous terrorist attacks.
Thank you, Martin. Before we jump to the last question, I will going to read one to Juliette by André Salazar-Bell. He asks, following the findings presented by Ms. Milgram-Baleix, education is hypothesized to have a strong power to transform perceptions of immigrants. However, Juliette, have you checked if not only levels of education, but particular forms or training, such as civic activities, peace-building training, or multicultural studies have a significant impact on migrant acceptance?
Thank you for the question. No, we did not check that. We only check the effect of formal education. We don't have information about that. So in this aspect, I take the opportunity of this question to decide that obviously our study has some advantages because we can compare very different countries with questions that other specific case studies cannot address. But it is completely complementary of other studies, and in particular about including a very study of a very specific area, because the debate about immigration is also that it is not only formal education, it is how we live all together, and in some areas it can be very difficult. In other areas, the integration of immigrants is very good. And on average, in our study, we find that for countries with high migrant stock, the opinion towards immigration are more positive than in others. So it seems that we are able to learn from each other and from differences, but we also know that there are some problems and some negative reactions. And for instance, in France, I think the policy debates have not tackled correctly this question, because we seem to this question has not been answered by politicians, and it is after only 20 years or 30 years with political parties following the extreme right growing, that we try to address fully this question. And we cannot, we need to know more about how integration policies can success, and this we need some more specific studies also in complement of the general studies such as the one we present.
Thank you, Juliette. One last question I would direct to Inmaculada, to our academic segment in our audience, the majority one. I know it's also a tough question. We have had some ideas from you, from Jose, from Martin as well, about future prospects now. So what is next in migration and refugee flows? If you had to reframe the issue today on the light of what we have achieved with this issue, so what are the next steps concerning migration and refugee flows?
Sorry.
No, sorry.
Yeah, Inmaculada, please.
Thank you. So I think academically, I think there are some issues that are still not well researched. And one of the issues is return migration. I think temporary programs for migrants will be, in my view, a solution in many instances, because most of the migrants want to return to their own countries, and many, if they are not there, is because they don't have the means of living there. So therefore, one way to temporarily solve some problems related to the origin countries will be to establish more temporary programs, and I think there are a need of studies trying to prove what is the outcome of those programs. Another issue that is still untackled is the governance policies in the Global South. There's studies about the policies in the European Union that are still also, they need a lot to do, especially the fact of not having a common migration policy is an issue. But I think in the Global South, many countries are having many different ways of dealing with migration, and this is under study. So I think this is something that needs also further research. And again, the problem of climate change and migration, I will say that this is something to investigate further as well. Thank you.
A hint for our researchers out there. We will stop the webinar here. Two final notes before we end the event. So this, you can access the special issue of this that was debated here with our speakers. I will share once again the link. You can access it anytime, anywhere. It is, as always, fully open access. The second note, this webinar was recorded and will be uploaded to our YouTube channel. All the attendees and speakers will be notified tomorrow once the video is available to be rewatched and shared. I would like to thank all the speakers in Inmaculada for helping putting up this webinar, Jose, Juliette, and of course Martin as well for your remarks, and a special thanks to our attendees for their questions and interactions with our speakers. I'll see you all in our next webinar. Thank you very much.